I always start these seminars with the same words. It's either okay or it's alright, so. Our societies are very much concerned with all forms of identity. If you, for instance, look at the current political or presidential debates both in Germany and the US, what becomes clear is that national identity, most importantly, seems to be the beginning and the end of some of those debates. Whether it's the predominance of right-wing nationalist movements or the choice between Trump and Biden, a choice that has now fortunately enough been made, what is at the center of these choices and questions is most of the time what or who is this nation? What concepts and conceptions of Germany and the US are being provided? However, of course, national conceptions of nationhood and of identity are only one part of it. If we want to break it down to a personal level, if you scroll through Instagram or through other social media channels or self-help forums, what is notable is the points in which they become indistinguishable. When they talk about, for instance, the advantages of traveling, the focus is usually on how traveling helped them to find themselves, how much they could return to themselves and be themselves while doing so. This is a language that is also used by numerous self-help books, by dating advice, or by those dedicated to self-care. But what is this self that all of these people, these advices are talking about? Who are we? And if we try to define that, things quickly become quite problematic, because who am I? Sure, of course, my name, my gender, my age, that constitutes me, but it's very superficial. Now, I'm also a daughter, a friend, a teacher, a colleague, and with each context, I act very differently. I am different as a daughter than I am as a friend, and I'm certainly very different as a teacher than I am as a colleague or in other contexts. However, I'm also from Germany, so I am different as a German than I would be, for instance, as a Brit. All of these contexts, nation, family, friends, work, region, religion, etc., they constitute me, but they never give the full picture. They are rather hues in a multifaceted kaleidoscope that constitutes myself. If we were to believe dating advice and self-help books, however, then underneath all that, there would be a core me, some characteristic that bleeds into all of these roles, something that is inherently, exclusively, definitely me. And this idea of a stable and unified core, one that might be prone to changes but roughly stays the same, has enjoyed an incredibly long tradition in Western societies. Nowadays, scholars propose that there are essentially two approaches to the study of identities. One approach centers around a fully centered, unified individual endowed with the capacities of reason, consciousness, and action, whose center consists of an inner core, the so-called, or as Stuart Hall has called it, the Enlightenment subject. This idea of an inner and presumably stable core that transcends time is similarly expressed in Stuart Hall's description of the so-called sociological subject, who still holds a stable inner core of identity but constructs itself in relation to significant others, who mediate to the subject the values, meanings, and symbols, the culture of the worlds he or she inhabits. Stuart Hall stresses that through the repeated performance of cultural identities, the inner core is modified and the individual becomes a part of the social structure which it inhabits, thus stabilizing both the structure and the subject itself. Approaching identity from this point is termed an essentialist approach towards identity, or simply essentialism. Now, what is essentialism? Essentialism is, first of all, a term you will probably, throughout your studies, hear quite a bit of. Theoretically, essentialism, however, generally means that we assume one entity to have a stable set of characteristics that are necessary to its identity and to its function. As an example, for instance, Women are said to be emotional, in tune with their feelings, and demure. Taking an essentialist view on these assumptions would mean that these characteristics are features of all women, regardless of ethnicity, social location, age, historic location, or cultural background, simply because they are of a certain gender. Moreover, in order to be seen as a woman, you need to have and perform these features. And these characteristics are seen to be so inherently female that men cannot possess them. Men cannot be emotional, in tune with their feelings, or demure simply because they are men and not women. And I hope now that you're actually frowning at that, because, we all know that this is, of course, absolute bullshit. Which is incidentally also what feminists, theorists, politicians, and philosophers throughout the 20th century thought, because rather than holding on to essentialism, they denounced it and provided a different perspective, one that is directly influenced by their respective theoretic schools of thought, but which is also united by one common denominator, namely a non-essentialist approach to identity and categories of identification. Non-essentialism, which can take various forms from structuralism to postmodernism to post-structuralism, proposes that there is no inherent core. Instead, it hinges on the notion that in an increasingly globalized and culturally fragmented world, identity can be constructed from multiple centers. Identity in this case is formed and transformed continuously in relation to the ways we are represented or addressed in the cultural systems which surround us. The subject in this case assumes different identities at different times, identities which are not centered or unified around a coherent self. Within us are contradictory identities pulling in different directions so that our identifications are continuously being shifted about. While this comes with a few problems, non-essentialist approaches provide us with a few important points concerning the construction of identity. First, that identity is actively constructed and not at all an inherent feature of individuals. Second, that identity is constructed through social interactions and contexts, with different selves forming its entirety. Even if there is no stable core, we need stability, of course, because without it, we'd be absolutely overwhelmed, and constant uncertainty would probably neither help our mental state, nor would it probably help our ability to be able to construct meaningful identities for ourselves. However, we of course nonetheless sort of imagine ourselves to be the same person. Put a pin into that because we'll come back to that in a moment. Identity is thus a precarious balance of fluidity, namely in how far our identity is changeable and uncertain, and stability, meaning in how far our identity is fixed and unchanging. An identity needs to incorporate both continuity and unity on the one side, and transformation and plurality on the other side. And we're constantly in the process of negotiating this, as we're in a constant process of production. And with each interaction that we have, we also adapt and change or reinforce parts of ourselves and our personal identities. Now back to the business with sameness. After all, I have just basically argued against it, and then I still use it myself. Why is that? While we need stability across time, this sameness that we perceive is only imagined. As Kevin Robbins so absolutely succinctly notes, identity is to do with the imagined sameness of a person or of a social group at all times and in all circumstances, about a person or a group being and being able to continue to be itself and not someone or something else. Thus, sameness isn't so much staying the same person across time, but it is more an inner coherence of self which we need in order to function both as a social actor and as a person. Now, how do we construct this inner coherence? Well, We're all basically storytellers, and with each story we tell about ourselves, we give meaning to certain events while disregarding and not giving meaning to certain others. Events that form a very specific part of us at a very specific moment in time. And these stories, moreover, are not just random events that we string together, but we narrate these particular stories with a particular timeline, with particular characters, with a particular language. Basically, what we do is we engage in a form of historiography about ourselves. In fact, we are the narrators of our own life stories. Additionally, these stories often fit into a very specific mold, so that we, 3, create an imagined sameness, a coherence that involves and has to involve growth. Hence, we're not always across the time the same person. Rather, we are very much aware that we are positioned differently at different points in time. A notion that Kathleen Woodward stresses when she notes that individuals might see themselves as one and the same person over the course of their lives, while still retaining a sense in which they are differently positioned at different times and in different places, according to the different social roles they are playing. This change is part and parcel of the meaningful construction of self, which leads the self to become what it is at a very particular moment in time. But there is something else that is notable about these stories, namely that all the stories we tell are not only conscious and deliberate narrations of self, but they are also self-conscious and deliberate performances of the self, meaning that props, stage, script, etc. are very carefully selected, thought through and consciously enacted, all in order to perform, as Erving Goffman has argued, an ideal self that excludes negative aspects of the self. In fact, the idea that our identities are essentially performances is neither new nor is it too surprising if we look at identity as an interactional process. When it comes to performing identity, the metaphor of a theatre performance might be very much applicable and fruitful, as it allows us to look at the ways in which identities are enacted and reproduced. Moreover, seeing identity in general as a performance and the world as a stage on which it is performed also allows us to look at identity as an interaction between members of the same or of different social groups. Moreover, the notion of a dynamic process of meaning creation is implied, as performance continually reconstitutes identity by rehearsing and transmitting meanings. For this performance to be meaningful and productive, the interaction between the actors, and more importantly, the interaction between the actors and the spectators, is a necessary aspect, as meaning cannot be constructed without an other, and here I'm referring to the other with a capital O, because we do not exist unless there is someone who can see us existing. What we say has no meaning until someone can understand and hear what we say. In this case, it doesn't matter who the audience is as long as it's there. And the audience isn't just listening or providing recognition, but it is moreover giving feedback, immediate feedback that is, feedback that helps actors to perfect and transform the role. And here we could of course end the story of the other, but of course, as should have become clear by now, there is always a little bit more that I could and will explain. Now, whether it's an individual or a group, the other signifies not only a different and opposed place in a classificatory system from which we are dissociated by symbolic and clear-cut borders, but moreover, it serves as a focal point and a point of comparison for ourselves. This comparison goes hand in hand with ideas and processes of separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions, which have their main function to impose system on an inherently untidy experience. It is only by exaggerating the difference between within and without, above and below, male and female, for and against, that a semblance of order can be and is created. And this quote, incidentally, also gives us two main points that characterize our relationship with the other. On the one hand, it's the aforementioned clear-cut separation. On the other hand, it's the necessity to exaggerate these differences between us and them, between me and you, between different social groups and social actors. On the one hand, this of course does create order by imposing relatively rigid categories onto not only the other, but also onto ourselves. While each of these groups I've named are heterogeneous groups and are not all the same within, the process of stereotyping moreover homogenizes them, with the other being at times even dehumanized. And this imposition of simplified images to others has been called heterostereotyping, while the imposition of similarly oversimplified images onto ourselves is called autostereotyping. One of the main differences here being that heterostereotypes are usually negative and used to stereotype others, while autostereotypes are usually ideal and positive and used to stereotype ourselves or our own social groups. Othering becomes especially significant in times of personal or national crises, in which the significant other becomes activated, since the binary construction of us versus them helps in overcoming the crises by, for instance, using blaming and scapegoating strategies. Moreover, it is in such times in which Feindbilder often escalate. As Darnell has put it, Identitätskrisen gehen immer mit einer Zunahme bzw. einer Zuspitzung von Fremdbildern einher. Der andere ist nicht mehr nur der am anderen Ort, foreign and alien, er wird zum Fremden, strange, meaning that in times of crisis, the other stops being foreign and simply different and becomes strange. However, differences aren't quite enough to describe the process of othering. Even imposing exaggerated differences isn't enough to call it stereotyping or othering, because these markers of difference need to be charged with social meaning first. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a few steps back and look at the 19th century. The 19th century is a very curious place in time, because while a lot of our scientific foundations are being laid during that particular century, there's also a whole lot of batshit crazy science going on. Alright, so people have different head shapes. That is so far just a difference that occurs due to genetics or postnatal development. However, and here's where the difference becomes othering, these different head shapes were, in the wake of politics of race and ethnicity, infused with a particular social meaning. As such, the head shape of BAME individuals, that is Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, was seen to be an expression of their lesser social, intellectual and artistic position and capability, as opposed to, of course, white individuals. However, these differences weren't only used between the in-group, that is white Europeans, and the out-group, that is BAME individuals, but also between members of the same in-group. Phrenology, namely the study of head shapes, was also used in criminology, where certain head shapes were seen to be indicative of whether an individual was a criminal or not. And no matter if it was used in criminology or in finding a husband or in race politics, at all times it had a social impact because it was used to further discriminate against BAME individuals and socially and politically disenfranchise them, B, to push through tough punishments on unreasonable and unproven grounds, and C, in some cases, to mistakenly categorize people as mentally ill, criminal, or not worthy of further consideration. Othering in this case isn't the difference in head shape, but the political, social, and cultural repercussions that are justified by such a difference. Now back to othering and identity and the notion of performance. When we say that identity is a performance, this is only part of the full story, because certain aspects of our identity aren't a role we consciously take up, parts that we do not perform consciously or deliberately. And according to Irving Goffman, that could be explained insofar as for some actors who believe in their roles and perform them continuously, such roles eventually become automatic or become second nature, something actors do not think about any longer because the role has become perfected enough to be perceived as naturally occurring. And for the longest time, this was certainly the case for many aspects of ourselves, right up until the point when some theorists shattered this tried and tested formula by introducing and theorizing performativity, a concept coined by Judith Butler in respect to gender and gender identity. Now, it is one thing to say that we perform gender, which in some respects we do, for instance, when we consciously take up a female or male role in certain circumstances. However, this would also mean that this role and this acting is in any way crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. Now, to say that gender is performative is a little different. Because for something to be performative means it produces an effect. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. Now, remember the gender example I gave in the beginning? Usually we or our societies, by and large, still act as if being a man or being a woman is an internal reality that is simply true and natural about us, when in fact it is a phenomenon that is being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. Rather by, for instance, naming, we become a gender. We are being made into women and into men. And the act that one does, the act that one performs is in a sense an act that has been going on before one arrived on the scene. Hence it is an act which has been rehearsed, much like a script survives the particular actors who make use of it, but which requires individual actors to be actualized and reproduced as reality once again. That does not mean that there is an original that we're all conforming to. Rather, while gender scripts are available, there is no original or primary gender. It's all an imitation, because gender is an impersonation. Becoming gendered involves impersonating an ideal that nobody actually inhabits. And if we want to spin this idea further, we could apply performativity, namely impersonating an ideal that does not quite exist, an ideal that changes historically and culturally to many aspects of our identities, as each role requires a script, only some of which we fully know and understand, but which we nonetheless adapt to suit our specific circumstances. Gender and some, if not all, aspects of our identity are thusly discursively produced and constructed. And here as a brief side note, because while I imagine that many people know the word discourse, many might still think that this is simply a critical discussion or a critical debate or some such, which in theoretical or cultural and literature studies terms, it really isn't. Discourses are basically a group of statements which provide a language for talking about that is a way of representing a particular kind of knowledge about a certain topic. Subjects in this respect are not only produced through and within discourses and within specific discursive formations, but the subjects themselves produce the discourses. Yet in order to do so, the individual has to have taken a position in a discourse, which provides the subject with meaning that is only discernible from within the discourse. The discourses, therefore, as John Story has argued, enable, constrain, and constitute objects as well as subjects. Now, that does not only sound super complicated, but definitely super confusing. The question is, how does it work? And here I would like to look at the example of film. That doesn't mean that it's any particular kind of film, just simply film as an object of study. If we want to look at film from an economic perspective, film is simply a commodity. If we look at film from a literary studies perspective, film is an artistic text similar to literature. If we look at it from a historical perspective, film is a historical document. If we look at film from an art history perspective, it is simply another form of visual culture. If we look at it from a film studies or cultural studies perspective, it is a textual object of study or an example of popular culture. And all of these discourses, economics, culture studies, art history, history, literary studies, and so on, all these discourses systematically form the object of which they speak, as film is something different through each of these lenses. And each of these lenses or perspectives provides us with a specific language, a specific vocabulary, which we use in order to meaningfully talk about the object film itself. Because coming at someone who views film as a commodity with the argument that film is actually a potentially transgressive product of popular culture which has social and political impact wouldn't be very fruitful because, to put it very simply, neither would really understand the other properly. Thus, each individual would constitute film differently, and would be constituted differently simply by belonging to or reiterating a certain perspective, that is, a certain discourse. But now back to performance and performativity. There are a couple of problems with both ideas, performance and performativity, and I'm not the first, nor will I be ever the last to make note and point out these problems. Goffman's notion, while highly useful, is very much caught up in essentialist framings of identity, framings that become evident when we look at his idea that there is not only a stage area, but also a backstage one, where he assumes actors would be able to shed all roles and confirm or return to their true character. Butler's work, in comparison, and due to its predominance in gender studies, seems to be taken, well, rather for granted. Yet, some have argued that it is its ascension as a hegemonic framework within the field of gender studies that has led to the foreclosure of certain possible gendered identities. Thus, rather than being a universal concept to describe gender and gender identity, performativity has been seen as exclusionary, as an exclusionary way of conceptualizing gender, as it too, to some degree, clings to binary gender positions. However, both performance and performativity are still highly useful concepts for the construction of identity, because they allow us to look at the ways in which identities are enacted and reproduced. They also foreground identity as dynamic, as always in the process of production, by constantly rehearsing and transmitting meanings. To fix an exact meaning of identity through reenaction is almost impossible, for action always takes place in different spatio-temporal contexts. Yet, it is necessary to transmit a sense of continuity and coherence. Moreover, both approaches foreground the ambiguous nature of identity construction, both including subconscious and deliberate acts of construction, negotiation, and deconstruction, which brings us in a way full circle back to where we started out from, namely to the fact or the idea that our identities are being able to continue to be illusions of sameness brought about by continuous production and interaction.